Welcome to the Political Philosophy Podcast. I'm Toby Buckle. Crime and criminality are central concepts in American political life. Fears of crime, crime as a coded language for race, crime as a way of thinking about immigration or integration are recurring themes in our political campaigns. Now we must reckon with a movement that is running the country, that is obsessed with crime, absolutely obsessed with it, and yet is led by criminals. How do we make sense of that? Why does it appeal to people? Why is that appeal so resolute and long-standing? And how do we argue against it? I don't have any easy answers here. I'm not sure there are easy answers here, but I think it's worth talking and thinking about. My guest today is Josie Duffy Rice, who may well be familiar to many of you. She's a very distinguished writer on the criminal justice system and has been published in all sorts of outlets. Her work has also been featured on The Daily Show, Slate, NPR, and many others. This is my favourite sort of conversation on the show, which is one where we start with a set topic, but then just get into a more free-form conversation where we really are thinking through these ideas in real time. I really like to be able to properly get into it with someone like that. So don't take anything we're saying here, particularly maybe in the last third of the interview, as absolutely gospel truth. We're kind of just playing around with how we think about this towards the end, but I really love doing that, and I hope you appreciate this conversation as much as I appreciated having it. I won't do any more preamble than that. Let's get straight into it. Other than, as always, please do support the show if you enjoy it. You can do that on my Patreon page, which is patreon.com/political philosophy podcast. Links to everything else, all the other episodes, ways to follow, all my writing are on my website, politicalphilosophypodcast.com. politicalphilosophypodcast.com. Okay, so this is The Far Right and Criminality with Josie Duffy Rice. I am joined today by Josie Duffy Rice. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
So, just as a basic introduction, how did you start and how did you get interested in writing about criminal justice and criminal justice reform to begin with? Because it's perhaps not the cheeriest of topics to write about. What was your path into this?
It's not. I keep hearing people are always like, this must be very depressing. But I really love this work. And I got into it because after graduating from college in 2008, I graduated in December of 2008, right when the financial crisis happened. I couldn't find a job. And I was doing kind of like random jobs until
Me
someone,
too. We might be the exact same age, which I won't
yeah,
the rest,
yeah.
but that was
Are
my.
you
I
the same?
graduated
Or
in '08 as well, exactly straight into the crash. So yeah.
yeah, yeah, yeah. So you remember it was sort of like what there was no plan. There was really kind of like no jobs available. And I was doing kind of random jobs. And then someone asked me if I wanted to interview to be an assistant for the then head of the Bronx Defenders, public defense organization in the Bronx. And I was like, sure. I really didn't know much about public defense. Like I didn't have kind of like any theoretical background around criminal justice. I sort of peripherally knew that there were a lot of people in prison. But I didn't really have kind of um, direct insight into it until I took this job, and it really changed my life. And really kind of oriented, but I always wanted to write. I always loved writing. I went to law school and being a lawyer was not for me. Um, but really my whole life has since then has kind of just been centered around this system. It really, you know, anything could happen. I could end up doing all sorts of different work maybe later, but this to me feels like the work that is most fulfilling to me, working on and around criminal justice. And part of that is just because what it reflects about us as a society.
So I wanted to start at the like basic conceptual level, which I like doing as someone who's interested in political philosophy. And it can sometimes seem a bit abstract, but then I also think unless you get the categories you're using right at the beginning of the discussion, you're almost cursed to just get it wrong through the rest of it. So I like the
Hmm.
quote of yours, I think from your most recent Substack, quote, crime is an inherently political and often arbitrary concept. Explain.
Yeah, so I actually think that was written by my co-author Hannah Riley, but with something that she and I talk about all the time,
Okay.
which is that especially in America, or in particular in America, we have this kind of conception that crime and what is illegal and what is immoral overlap, right? And that the law reflects our values and our morality and is kind of an ethical set of rules that we all buy into in order to kind of keep society moving. The truth is that sometimes that's true. Sometimes what's illegal and immoral overlap. And often what's illegal is not immoral, and other times what's immoral is not illegal. And it's very hard for people to kind of conceptualize that crime itself, what is a crime, what isn't, is a political choice, right? It's reflective of what is kind of like the driving political forces at the time. What are the politics of the moment? When you look at what we focused on in the 80s as crime versus what we focused on in the 90s versus what we focus on now versus what we focused on in, around the financial crisis when we started talking about like white collar crime. Um, what we conceptualize as a crime and also what behavior is determined to be a crime versus not is inherently political. There is no kind of driving moral force behind it. It is a reflection of the political constraints and opportunities of the moment. I think once you understand that or really integrate that into the way that you think about the law, it really does change a lot about how people see themselves in relation to in relation to criminals and crime, right? Because um, so much of what drives our determination of someone's moral and ethical value is their predilection towards crime, right? And the truth is that once you kind of understand, not that it's arbitrary, because I wouldn't say it's arbitrary, but I would say it is um, um, much more complicated than just whether this person is good or bad, a danger or not a danger. Then you can have a much more expansive view of the role that crime and criminality and deeming people a criminal plays into how our society functions.
Yeah, I think not just for crime, but for any political concept, I think people find the thought that it's up for grabs and sort of determined by politics and by conversations quite scary. But there's also an
Mhm.
empowering side in that it is what it is what you make of it. These are
Yeah.
human-made things that can are important and real, but can also change depending on our needs for them.
Right. I mean, in other words, policy got us into this mess and policy can get us out, right? I mean, that is the lesson to me of mass incarceration. And as you said earlier, like this is not always a very happy topic. In fact, it's often very depressing, but there is something about working in criminal justice that I do find hopeful, and that it is a problem we created, mass incarceration or our overbearing police state, and it's a problem we could uncreate, right? It's a problem we could dismantle. Um, it's not easy to do that, but it's certainly possible.
One analog to crime is an inherently political concept. Something I've written a bit about is criminal is an inherently political
Oh, absolutely.
concept. And it's
Yeah.
one that's contested and there's different definitions out there. So there's sort of a dictionary definition of a criminal is a person who commits a crime, who violates a statute that's on the laws. That's certainly one way the word is used. But there's also this other way, which is actually people, it's an inherent property of people. Some people are just
Mm,
intrinsically immoral, and some people aren't. In COVID,
right.
we had people saying, we shouldn't treat people who break the law as criminals. But then what are they?
Right. Right.
Um, and the answer is it's a heavily racialized and in some ways class-based term to denote an
Hmm.
intrinsically evil, impure internal enemy. And that is totally up for grabs over time. And it
Yeah.
changes, might talk in American history about how certain groups, whites, Irish, Italian,
Hmm.
Hispanic, move in and out of different categories. But there's nothing there's different ways we think about what a criminal is, explicitly or
Yeah.
implicitly, and those ways change over time and they can be changed.
Your point about COVID, I think, is a really good one. And I think it's particularly kind of tangible in this moment in America, where you can see that in certain isolated situations, people understand this concept, right? They understand that the idea of a criminal is political, is loaded, is reflective of the political kind of winds at that moment. And one major example of this is our president, right? Um, you have basically half of the country who says he they don't care that he's a criminal, or they don't, or he was, his prosecution was criminal politically motivated, or he shouldn't be a criminal, et cetera. And then you have this other half which kind of uses the term criminal as a stand-in for all of these other faults, for this sort of deep immorality of him as a leader. And it's a constant, it's a daily reminder to me just how easily it is to weaponize this idea of someone being convicted of a crime, right? And then how easy it is to kind of how when we're invested in someone or care about them or like quote unquote on their side, how we suddenly understand that like being convicted of a crime doesn't necessarily dictate who they are as a person. And it's just an interesting kind of dichotomy because it is very hard for people to apply that across the board, but
Hmm.
you see them apply it in individual cases and with individual people, especially when they're high profile, right? Where suddenly people sort of start to understand um, how arbitrary that such a term can be.
What do you? Well, I wasn't actually planning on asking you about this, but what do you make of
Please.
what do you make of the way that the Trump, let's just limit it to the felony conviction in the Manhattan case, that was used as a sort of rhetorical point by his opponents? I'm kind of conflicted because on the one hand, is this at the heart of my concerns about Trump? No.
Right. No.
This is like at the same time, I think there's a hypocrisy charge to be pointed out by people for whom law and order is something of a totem. There is perhaps a thin sense in which I might attach some moral weight to it, in that, this is how our society, this is the process our society uses for taking these things out of contestation. Is it Donald Trump is a good or a bad guy, right? Did he behave improperly or not? Well, we kind of have a process to say, okay, well, we'll put it before a jury of your peers, you'll have a defense, blah, 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 blah. And as flawed as that process is, that is our process. And he did go through
Hmm.
it, and it did render a verdict on him
Hmm.
you
Hmm.
know, and,
Yeah.
and while you can say maybe there was some political motivation in it, the fact that he was a former president meant he got really, I think, almost at every turn in that case, a sort of favorable judgment, and he still got a conviction. And it's like, is it my number one thing? No. Is it maybe even on my top five against Trump? Yeah, probably not. But there is some sort of feeling to to the extent our society has objective processes for determining wrongdoing, he did go through it. And shouldn't
Right.
that count for at least something? So I don't know. I see what people say when they say, look, the criminal justice system is so awful in so many ways. Let's not use the language of it. I get that argument. At the same time, I kind of do feel some force to the argument I just made. I'm conflicted. I don't know. How do you feel about that?
I think I feel similar to you in that like we are and I think especially it matters, right, that he is president of the United States, that like we with much power becomes much responsibility, that when someone with that level of power behaves improperly or violates the law, like it does kind of it matters that they go through the same process that other people have to go through, et cetera. I think you could argue like, you know, to your point, Donald Trump's kind of brazen lawlessness, and brazen corruption. And I mean that in like all the different ways, right? I mean that in the way that last week when him and Elon Musk were getting into it, he's threatening to cancel Elon Musk's contracts, right? Like, I mean, like the Schadenfreude in me would love to see both of them destroy each other, but there is something very kind of fascinating in the ways in which like 10 years ago, if someone threatened to do that, there would be allegations of, of corruption, and they would definitely face investigation, if not like full indictment. Um, I think there's also an argument to be made that maybe he was like maybe slightly overcharged in the Manhattan case, but he was not charged in all these other cases. Like you look at what happened here in Atlanta, where I live, where, in Georgia, he called the Secretary of State and he said, please find me some votes. And then that would have gone right to trial if our DA had not gotten into an improper relationship with like all these outside factors played into him not actually having to face any kind of consequences for that action. I think like there's an enormous hypocrisy on the right. You see it not just with Trump's conviction, but you see it with, and you brought up earlier, like kind of like the COVID prosecution stuff, but you also see it with January 6th, right? Like literally this week, we have the president standing in front and saying you can't disrespect police officers while he just pardoned 1,500 people or however many it was who disrespected police officers and more at the Capitol a few years ago. But I think it really does reflect, right, just how slippery these concepts are and how important it is, I think, as a citizen, as like a resident of the country, to have some sort of um, value set and morality that exists outside of the law. What are you willing to accept from the people who represent you, and what are you not? What and those are your standards, or I believe should be your standards, regardless of person and regardless of the law, right? Like that it's an interesting factor, right? That Stormy Daniels, which is has a lot is kind of the basis of his conviction in New York, like this idea of cheating on your wife. That's not illegal, but that's pretty immoral. Cheating, many people would say like hiring sex workers is immoral, even if it wasn't necessarily illegal in that scenario. Like there's all of these ways in which his conviction touches on all these other kind of like moral and ethical quandaries that people face, um and that whether or not you endorse them or not do have moral import that are separate from the actual question of the law. I don't know if what we're going to end up with is something better or worse, when it comes to Trump in terms of actually being prosecuted, because I think it's notable that he got convicted and he got elected again. I think he would have gotten elected again either way. I don't think that's what drove the election, but I do think that in some ways
It didn't feel like a big deal either way.
it didn't feel like a big deal. And it doesn't feel like a big deal to most people here. And neither does a lot of this, right? Neither does the same people who are calling for harsher prosecution of drugs. This report comes out that Elon Musk is, doing all these drugs in the White House. Nobody cares. There's a lot of pay to play. Nobody cares. It is I think truly a reflection of how much I think our moral kind of an ethical agreements as a society, to the extent that they existed, have really been eroded um, by Trump. And in some ways, he's just highlighted how flimsy they maybe were to begin with.
I think that's exactly right. Let me build a couple of points off that and you can agree or disagree. I think I think there's always been a slight not hypocrisy, there's been a contradiction in how law has been practiced in this country for the last 40 years, which is nominally you have this idea of equal justice before the law and Lady Liberty is blind and all of that. Now, we've always kind of known that there's an implicit undercurrent in which there's differential standards, right? But the idea that, the law treats everyone equally and we're not going to overtly say that some groups are more penalised than others, has at least it's been something people pay lip service to, if not always observe, right? And I think
Right.
I agree. It wasn't a case that there was a substantive agreement that broke down. There was a sort of thin rhetorical elite consensus that has
Hmm.
fallen apart now. And I was so struck by the COVID case where you had the right saying this is a direct quote from Greg Abbott, actually. We are not going to arrest small business owners who break the law. They are not criminals. Well, if they break
Mm.
the law, then what are they?
Right.
Um,
Right.
but then at the same time, you had people talking about the BLM protests as criminals, even when they weren't
Hmm.
breaking the law. And it seemed
Right.
that this undercurrent had just, reached escape velocity and was now the overcurrent that now, for many people, they are no longer even pretending to believe in this idea
Hmm.
of a sort of liberal universality or the equal dignity of persons, or however you want to express it. Now it is very overt that that there should be different rules for sort of the true citizenry and the internal enemy, and I think
I think that's right.
that's exactly right. It's not something has been lost, right? I don't want to say like I think as progressives, we can sometimes slip into a trap of everything's always just awful and evil and it never changes. No, something was lost, but what was lost
Yeah.
was quite illusory in some senses, or at the very least,
Yes.
never stable or permanent.
Yes, I think that's completely right. And I would go even further and say that so much of this is a reflection of your immediate environment, right? And the fact that like I think especially post-Trump, post-Trump's first election, right? We see a lot more, and I kind of hate this word, but I'm going to use it for lack of a better one, tribalism, um, in within groups, within people, right? So people live in neighborhoods with
It's an
people
overused
whose
word, but it is a real thing.
it's a real thing. And, we see that people tend to live, interact, keep relationships with people who agree with them. And that goes, I think that is even reflected of what we see online these days. Like I would bet, I don't know this for a fact, but I would bet that if you did an assessment of, you know, um, people's the relationships that people have with someone on the in a different political party 10, 20 years ago versus now, like there would be a lot more overlap. And um and in some ways that really underscores what we think about when we think about criminality because it usually is the other. It's not usually that people in their own neighborhoods, in their own communities are seeing a pattern of behavior and thinking, you know, this needs to be these people all of these people need to be arrested, right? You tend to make excuses for what you know, what you see, and you tend to be a better kind of judge of risk, I think, of what's nearby versus what's over there. And at this point, um I think this is especially true on the right, but it's been true on the left in the past as well. Like there's a real sense that everybody who who is left of center um is an anarchist, communist, violent criminal who is waiting in the wings. Like that fear, I think, is really, really real and is being exacerbated kind of constantly. And when you can demonize an entire group of people that way, it's very easy to say, like, my people can't be criminals and your people can't be anything but criminal, right? And I think it's really reflected in that Abbott quote because it's interesting of like who's a criminal and who's a freedom fighter, right? And all of that just gets back to the individual politics. So little of that is the actual behavior.
Yeah, I've really been struck. We're recording in the midst of federal troops being sent to LA.
Yeah.
This, I think, is something the right wanted to do. Like they elected Trump to do this.
Hmm.
This is what they wanted. And like I am struck to the extent people are living in just totally different worlds. Like there is a real view among many conservatives that like the most excessive moments of the BLM riots from the tail end of the Trump presidency or, the mid 2010s sort of period, that is just what big cities are like all the time. They are just these permanent, anarchic, violent, lawless
Right. Right.
places. And like I was at some BLM protests, people brought their kids. It's like,
Right.
you
Right.
know, like it's
Right.
not even in an activist moment. It's a completely distorted view. And I
A
don't,
100%.
and it's just such an alternate world. And I don't know what we're supposed to do about that because you can never ensure total message discipline off a movement. And what people who have concerns about racial injustice are supposed to just stay quiet about them forever. Neither of those are real.
Right.
But it does seem that like they've been being pumped this Fox News image of like a black youth with a mask across their face throwing a Molotov
Yep.
every night for a decade, and it has rotted their brains. And now
It
they
has.
see Los Angeles as like Iraq at the height of the insurgency, and we just have to send troops in. And it's
Hmm.
delusional, but I'm not sure what's to be done about it anymore either.
Yeah. I mean, this is like, to me, um, the biggest problem that we face, right? Because you are seeing what happens when, um, this, like you said, this sort of demonization of these moments, and this focus on them reshapes people's entire perspective of a group or a place. Like some of this, again, it's sort of like it would fall apart immediately if you guys went and spent a little time in a city. Like you can go to New York City and you'll be fine, right? You can go to LA. I mean, to your point about the LA stuff, I was just talking to someone that I'm been working on a story about them for a year now, and they're in Michigan. And I was talking to his wife, and his wife's like, "Oh my gosh, your husband's in LA. Like, is he okay? Have you talked to him?" And I'm like, "He's fine. LA's fine. LA's actually totally fine." There's like, there was a block of a little bit of chaos maybe one night. Everybody like no serious injuries. Everybody's okay. Like, but they are going to drive like massively increase the police state because of this perception. And there is no kind of people don't have their own really lived experience in these spaces to be able to counter that. It's really it's really just it's a playbook and it's such an obvious one, but it really is quite effective. And I think to your point about the protests as well, like I don't know if you've ever been in a city when like their team won, right? When like they win the Super Bowl, or thinking about even just a few
Yeah.
weeks ago, like the
Dude,
Knicks.
I'm British. I grew up here. Have you
Right,
seen how we behave
right,
about soccer?
right, exactly. And there's like stuff gets set on fire, people running down the streets, like a true panic that if you were to change the dial just a little bit, you could make it incredibly sinister and incredibly dangerous. But instead, we have all kind of embraced that this is like a tradition. It is what people do when they get excited. A couple things get ruined, but everybody goes home and they're okay. Right. But it is, um, I mean, look, this is incredibly convenient for the government. It's incredibly convenient for the federal government to be able to use this as a tool to kind of say California is a lawless place. Gavin Newsom doesn't know what he's doing. LA is full of, illegals and criminals and who would want to live there. And they are counting on the fact that people are not really interested in figuring this out for themselves and finding out for themselves what they really think about some of these places, and also how they really can um contextualize people's anger. You know, but I think this gets back to the broader philosophical point to me, which is my kind of own personal philosophy on criminal justice has evolved over the years, and I it has just shifted so drastically into um, a real awareness of the state, not in terms of the state's ability to assist people, but in their ability to punish people. And it's very, very difficult for me to imagine a scenario where I am more scared of the protester or or, the rioter, quote unquote, than I am of the cops who are sent in to control them, because the power differential is so drastic and so consistent. There is, to me, um, very, very, very little reason to ever send the Marines into a city. I'm sure I could think of one, but it's hard for me to think of one.
I mean, it's not
Because
this.
would you say it's not this? It's
Yeah.
certainly not this, and it's you know, it's not the weight of that is so enormous, and because people are too busy being scared of over what's happening over there, they're not actually um giving adequate kind of consideration to what it means to have the federal government send in the National Guard, right, to control protesters. It's even if they were burning things down, even if it was as violent as they are claiming that it was, I still think the bar for kind of government intervention in that way should be much higher.
Yeah, and let me give you another example because I think, where people default to when we talk about criminal justice reform or abolition or these sorts of words is, what about rapists and murderers and so on? I'm
Hmm.
fine to just bite that bullet and say, oh yeah, absolutely. For like rapists and murderers, we do need, for some people, you do need some sort of system that keeps them away for the rest of us. Does that
Hmm.
system have to be prisons as currently instantiated? I think
Right.
clearly they're, even by their own sort of targets, counterproductive, but that's another conversation. I think where we want to be careful is thinking about all the other ways in which people imagine that sort of invasive, violent control needs to be broadened. One that and perhaps let me get you to talk about this, thinking about a lot recently, is immigration and the
Hmm.
way we have built up structures that are outside of the normal checks and balances that are very violent and have an institutional culture that sees the people they interact with not as people deserving of rights. And all that has had to change for the fascists now that they have the keys to the car is they just have to broaden the category of who is a
Yep.
person not deserving of rights. That's it. The
Right.
car's there. You just need to drive it in a different direction?
Completely. That's completely right. I mean, and I think to your point about immigration is exactly right. Like, and and um when you hear and see people who are just kind of violently against immigration and are really for mass deportation, et cetera, like it's striking how many of them usually do not live around anybody who's undocumented, right? They are projecting a caricature, um, and they have associated they are using one behavior as a stand-in for so many others. Um, and I think the immigration example is the perfect one for that exact reason. Like, you increase the police state, right? You hire a ton more ICE officers, you make a quota of 3,000 arrests a day, et cetera. Well, eventually, like, they need something else to do, because this is not actually at this level sustainable for the long term, right? It becomes harder to identify undocumented people. Like, people go into hiding, less people cross the border, et cetera. And then you still have the state, and the state never reduces itself. I think that is especially the punishment state never kind of self reduces. It's just not how it functions. And so I think there is this level of short-sightedness that's so reflective of like reactionary politics that um I don't want to say like the immigration problem is a problem because of what it could mean for us. It's a problem on its own. Like, what we are seeing happen to people who are accused of um you know being here illegally, but not actually committing any harm, not actually doing anything wrong day to day, like operating as we would want like an ideal co-society member to operate. The fact that we're seeing them rounded up, deported. I just talked to a friend who's an immigration lawyer. She was saying there's no standing room in detention in New Jersey right now, and that people have been standing for days, shoulder to shoulder. And these, like, they're being, this is like stuff you read about in history books level kind of punishment. Um, but the fact that like we have allowed ourselves to be convinced that the the guy at the dry cleaner, who maybe is undocumented, is a bigger threat than the ICE agent who comes, who breaks the window and pulls him out. I wonder what you would say about this. Like, America really likes to think of itself as this sort of individual state that is skeptical of government, skeptical of power, that really values freedom. That's what we were built on. We're different than other countries in that way. We really care about this. And to me, the past few years have been a reminder that like we're not different. Everybody is kind of susceptible to this laying down and uh letting the punishment infrastructure grow because of who you're scared of, right? It really is just a reminder that we're not any different than anyone else in any other place.
Yeah, and I mean, as something of an internationalist who's another enemy in the eyes of these people who's lived in a few different countries, yeah, America isn't any different. It's also another way in which we're quite similar is that we think we're exempt. Like the British,
Hmm.
despite the fact that we
Hmm.
had an empire not that long ago, think we've totally gotten over racism. They're
Hmm.
really quite
Hmm.
baffled by the idea that you might think we have institutional racism in the UK. Americans, at least on the liberal side, are usually belatedly aware that slavery might have
Hmm.
ongoing repercussions. Other
Right.
countries can be even blind. I mean, try talking to a Frenchman, my God. Um,
Right.
um,
Right.
but in many ways, America's self-blindness is in itself quite typical, I would say.
Hmm.
To your point about freedom, freedom is a concept I have spent a lot of time on. What I would say there is just like crime, just like criminal, freedom means different things to different people. And
Yeah.
freedom has a dark side. There is a fascist conception of freedom, which
Mm.
is the Nazis talked a lot about freedom, the liberation of the racial group from
Right.
impurity.
Right.
I think on the American right, they are not insincere in claiming to value freedom, but it's just a very different ideal. It is an ideal of the true citizenry within a country being liberated, the true citizenry, both being freed from control of the federal government, but also freed from things that would prevent them controlling the internal enemies. Right.
Mm. Yeah. Hmm.
I call it supremacist liberty. Freedom is not just about being left alone, it's about having power. And even on
Yeah.
the left, we would say, it's not just about the state not interfering with you, it's about having healthcare and opportunity,
Right.
so on and so forth, right? So its freedom is
Right.
both about not having things and having things. To the right
Right.
is about not having the federal government controlling you, but also being able to control the non-citizen, the
Right.
unreal American within your own
Right.
country. And it's not an incoherent vision. It is simply a vision that is not coherent with liberal fundamentals. It's not
Right.
coherent with the idea of universal access to the law or equal dignity of persons. But for the really hardcore, they don't even really claim to believe those things anymore, I think. But it is a liberationist movement. I know that's a dark thought, but it is a liberationist struggle in some ways, but it's an ethnically based liberationist struggle.
Right. Well, you can only have your freedom has to come at the cost of someone else's, right? And I
Yeah.
think a lot of that is, like you said, about power. And I think people really, really, really have underestimated, especially people on the left, right? The role that power, kind of the inherent role that the inherent importance of power to people, even when they don't realize it. I will never forget that when Obama got elected, my dad, who worked in local politics for when I was a kid, was like, this is gonna, white people don't give up power very easily. And so like we are on the brink of something different. And I remember that because I was, again, we were around the same age. Like I was in college and like on the streets of New York, and it was like this amazing moment. It's the first time I ever voted. Um and I felt this like feeling like he was so retrograde for really believing that like many of the people who had voted for this guy would were actually in some ways uncomfortable with what some of this meant. And I think the same thing about the Black Lives Matter movement. Like there, even a lot of the people who were could agree with the premise didn't weren't necessarily as comfortable as they would have thought they would have been with like the shift in what they saw as a shift in power. And in some ways, that's those chickens are coming home to roost right now, and we really see that at this moment. Which is not to say that like I don't mean to say that everybody is that all white people or even most white people are like violently racist. What I mean to say is that like the ways in which power benefit us um, without us really realizing it, uh, once we realize it and we feel like it's being lost, it feels very difficult to share that power without it feeling like it's actually disappearing.
Yeah, I think this is my next article. There was a sort of pervasive, Samantha Hancock's calls it the long 90s, i.e. a sort of thin cultural consensus that sort of stretched out into the and then of course decisively ends in 2016. But like if you squint, and I mean really squint, you can think, okay, we're moving towards a colorblind society here. We're sort of slowly getting over this. Um, and there was some value to that, but it was also illusory. There was for a variety of complex historical reasons, it had become less acceptable for a politician to stand up and argue for segregation, but it had never gone away. We just sort of obfuscated it in a number of
Hmm.
important ways. And I find this complicated to think and talk about because that sort of obfuscation did bring some benefits, even as it locked in existing inequalities. But it also meant what am I talking here? Centrist white liberalism, when I say we, were so caught off guard by Trump. Like it just didn't
Hmm.
seem possible to a lot of people. And it took us the better part of a decade and to the extent some people still really haven't, to really have the measure of what we were fighting.
Right. Yeah, I think that's right. I think that's totally right. And I also think, I mean, I also think there's a refusal kind of on both sides. This is obviously true on the right, as we kind of have discussed, but there is an unwillingness, I think, to identify what about Trump has galvanized so many people. So I got in this conversation a couple years ago with a friend where her thing about Trump was just like, he's so gauche, essentially. Like this has been her kind of driving. Her thing has always kind of been the aesthetics of Trump. Like she doesn't like his beliefs, but she also really doesn't like his aesthetic, his kind of aesthetic sense and how he kind of conveys himself, translates to the world. And it was an interesting conversation because we both came away thinking, well, if Trump was this exact same way, but he was on the left, right? Like we would also love him. We would love him. We would think this is funny. We would think his like little bits are funny. We would embrace what the left currently sees as like this anti-intellectual, brash, um, aggressive, sort of mean character because it would be aligned with our values, right? And I think it has been very difficult. Trump's Trump's personality has been such a value add for him because it has obscured in so many ways like liberals and people on the left's ability to understand his what attracts people to him. And in that way, like I think we've been caught flat-footed over and over and over again because
Yes, yeah.
we have a very difficult time seeing what I think what who I think we could be, right? If the tables were turned just a little bit.
Yeah, and to understand not everyone is like you, not everyone thinks like you. Like, the most hardcore Trump supporters are not, they believe what they are telling you they believe about the world.
Yeah.
When they say these cities are hellholes, when they say the most overtly racist or sexist, they believe these things. They're not
Hmm.
saying that because of some they're not saying that because they're disappointed socialists who just didn't get what they want economically and have now become
Right.
racists. They often are just racists. And
Right.
that they're not, as centrist columnists would have it, people who have been culturally disrespected by social justice movements. Maybe they have, but like again, they that there is a value system out there that is real and is active and does just sees the world through such different glasses to us. And I think we just project ourselves onto others in a way that's made us quite naive.
Yeah, I think that's right. But I also think there is, well, I mean, I think two things. I think the number one thing that drives people is fear.
Mm,
And just day-to-day fear. I mean, as a parent, I can say that like I am regularly shocked at how other parents move through the world completely dependent on fear, worry that someone's going to come, fear of someone taking their child, fear of someone hurting their child, fear of like, you know, I don't want my to put my kid's name on, on the tag of his shirt because what if someone comes to take him and then they know his name and then they think like all these sort of like totally irrational fears, right? I I am always telling parents like no one wants your kid. No one's here to kidnap your kid. I like it's just not going to happen. But there is this driving like the way that kind of parenthood is socialized, right, is around this constant um fear. I mean, right now, I think the other place that it's exact been, it's exploded is vaccines. Like this just constant fear of like something happening to your kid, of your kid being hurt, of um of someone coming to take something that's yours, right? Or take something from you. But
but
the
do
other
you
thing
think?
that,
Sorry,
yeah, go ahead.
go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say, but the other thing that drives people, I think across the board, and this is like, I think that if I was to say about the foundational belief, this is probably it, is like everybody thinks they're the underdog, basically. And that feeling, that inability to see how and where you exist in society, in the world, the advantages you have, what actually is your responsibility and what isn't, the disadvantages you have, right? But there is sort of this kind of constant, and I don't know if this is particularly American, but it's certainly very present in America, this constant feeling of I'm not getting my due, right? And the way that that manifests is racism largely, right? But I mean, look at what we're seeing in the rise of misogyny. Look at what we're seeing kind of like, anti-citizen, anti-international aid, like all the sense of I'm being taken advantage of. I should have more than I have. And that person over there has more than they should is the kind of entire political basis for, I think, in many ways, both parties, one party more than the other. But you saw it, I think, in the Trump era too, where there was a sense of people who did have access to institutions, who did live more of an elite life, who thought they deserved it, or that the people who didn't have this didn't. And I think that I think you see it on the left and on the right, and I think that as a I mean, to the podcast point, as a political philosophy, being the underdog is pretty fragile, but it's also incredibly resilient. It's fragile intellectually, it's fragile practically. It can't hold up to much scrutiny, but the feeling is incredibly resilient. And it's very hard to eradicate that feeling from people, especially when an entire party feels it, you know?
Yeah, it's a self-righteous framing device, right?
Yeah.
That we're all. I guess that it's a chicken and an egg thing, but there is also a question of what's the input, what gets funneled into that self-righteous framing. Because, certainly I could critique let us just say, the Bernie Sanders left and say you have this self-righteous view of like a disenfranchised proletariat, but come on, you're not. I know you guys. I came up with you guys. You're educated college kids who live just fine by the standards of the world and
Mhm.
history. But I'm not offended by those people. I get where they're coming from.
Right.
Like, if they're perhaps slightly LARPing on a working class aesthetic, I'm
Right.
not as bothered. You know what I mean? The input is a bit different. Whereas the input for the right really is a lot of these darker historical forces.
100%. Yep.
The thing I was going to
Yeah.
say about vaccines
Yeah.
is I've actually been reading about this recently. It's surprisingly not modern. Like a lot of not just the ideology, but the specific talking points are all this sort of like interwar anti-Semitic stuff that has just
Oh,
been
totally.
recycled over the years,
Mm-hmm.
over and over again.
Hmm.
Like fascists have been on about water fluoridation,
Right.
but my entire adult life, for some reason,
Hmm.
the idea that we shouldn't have cavities in our teeth really something that somehow links to the Jews, I don't know. But like
Right.
is like a recurring theme. So yes, we all want to couch ourselves as underdogs. And you could, and this is universal, you could think about the Brits at the height of the empire with John Bull and plucky little Englishmen, and we ruled a quarter of the globe, you know?
Right.
Um,
Right.
so it's
Right.
universal, but I think like what feeds into it does change as well, and is different for different people.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think it's also kind of a way of asserting your own value and importance, right? Is this sense that people are out to get you. So it's
Yeah.
both this like enormous anti-Semitic history, and so much of this is institutionally racist, and but it's also this sense of like I'm important enough to poison, right? I'm
Yeah.
important
Yeah.
enough to chip. When I I think that that in a general sense, that's simply untrue, and unnecessary. I think this too is a real benefit to me, of being Black and having Black family in America, which is that like the things that I grew up being skeptical of were we're almost the opposite. It's like no, you understand the value of like social services and
Mm.
fluoride and vaccines because not that many generations ago, right? You were like you had ancestors that and recent ancestors and ancestors in Georgia, right? On plantations who had no access to kind of any healthcare or any care at all. So I think there is still this sort of sense of like you can understand how bad it is on the other side, but there is not sort of this belief um in the ideals of America in the same way that seems so pervasive um on the right. And I'm just thinking this out in real time, but I think that is um I think being able to be thoughtful about I guess I think that there is some sort of disconnect, right, between a party and a group of people who feel as if America is undeniably the best place in the world, that not being dedicated to America, not fighting for America, going against America is in itself some sort of crime, right? That protesting, holding a Mexican flag while protesting is tantamount to treason. That I heard Trump say the other day that you should, um, that burning the flag should be a crime. Like that sort of um, almost thoughtless patriotism that exists in tandem with people who are thinking the government is constantly trying to kill us by inventing vaccines and or putting fluoride in our water. And these two kind of ideas of like what this country is for us are so inconsistent that it feels like you almost can't try to you almost can try to kind of like make them align. The minute you try to build a coherent philosophy out of that, it fails. And so all you have are these driving kind of feelings. You can't really draw a line from A to B that makes sense. All you can really be driven by is these emotions, these feelings of both fear, resentment, and really, again, being the underdog. I feel like that drives everything. And really, that's the underpinnings of our criminal justice system too. That's how you get 2.5 million people in prison,
Mm.
right? Um is being overly driven by this perspective that everything different is scary and
Mm.
that everything is out to get you and that you were constantly at risk of
Mm.
losing it all, or being harmed if we don't if we're not locking up dozens of people a second.
Mm. No, I think that's right. And I think we all, to a degree, start with feeling and build philosophy around it. But yeah,
Mm,
Yeah, I
yeah.
think that's right. Yeah, if we had another hour, I would say yeah, there's something that goes back to Reconstruction and the idea that your country's
Yeah.
stolen from you and you're the real Americans. But yeah,
Yeah. And
um,
look, just as a point of trying to be sympathetic or understanding of a perspective that I truly in my heart find disgusting. I think that identity is a really, I think that identity is so tied to everything else in our kind of personal history, right? So like the way that people think about their role in America comes from their parents, it comes from their grandparents, it comes from like sitting on their laps and hearing stories of their family. It comes from hearing about how you're and Clint Smith actually wrote about this beautifully in his book, like going to these kind of Confederate reenactments, these Confederate like celebrations, and hearing people say, well, this is a memory to me. This is the people that I loved told me this thing, and I loved them and I respected them, and I carry this on. Um, I carry this on. This is essentially an emotional, nostalgic response, not as more than it began as that more than it began as a coherent worldview. And I wonder, like, if this is inevitable unless we kind of re this kind of racism, these kind of like racist resurgences, this kind of idea of who's a real American is sort of inevitable unless we kind of reconceptualize from the beginning what the value of being a real American is. Because I think by the time that you really start to interrogate it for people, it's already very woven into their identity in a way that it's easy for us to say, well, that doesn't make any sense and that shouldn't be valuable to you, and I'm a real American too. But it's not always easy to let that stuff go. And it's not always easy um, to kind of rebuild your self-identity later once it's already kind of formed. I don't really know what to do with that other than
well,
to say that, like,
this would be my case for a very normie sort of liberalism. Like it's nice to maybe this doesn't have to be go to college, but to go to different places, to have friendships and relationships with people who have a different set of emotional and nostalgic
totally.
actions, and to sort of live in a pluralist world and not totally forsake everything. I don't, to take a very obvious case, I don't want black people to have to suddenly give up particular family histories or
Right,
a certain sense of identity. Or not even do I want white Southerners to have to, but to understand that you are one part of a bigger picture and to see that other
right.
people have their own stories and paths in. I think even
I
just,
think that's the greatest part about living in like America and living in
yeah.
kind of a ostensibly kind of liberal country is that you do get an enormous amount of exposure and learning, and it doesn't actually affect, it doesn't have to affect your own kind of personal identity. It doesn't,
Hmm.
you don't get lost. It doesn't mean you get lost in it. But I think that to feel that way requires a set of values um and let's see, requires a set of values and I would say um almost environments from early on in your life to even know to appreciate that. I think to your point, like most people when they experience that appreciate it. But the valuing it before you've experienced it, I think is very, very hard to implement as um once you've learned kind of an entire different set of what to appreciate. And I think also like again, people overestimate their own importance. And this is what people think makes them important. And so I do worry that like the liberal kind of approach, which is essentially to say, you're not saying this, but I think this is sort of the political approach, which is to say like these things don't matter. It may be correct, but it's not effective because we're trying to
What's
kind of
what's the these things in this sentence that
you're
don't?
being the real American, being
Right.
having this history as like a real, a real. This is really my country.
Yeah.
We can say like that's not true, that doesn't matter, but we are giving a logical response to what I think is inherently an emotional, um, driving, motivator, and I
Yeah.
don't
Or at
know
the very
how to
least,
affect how to do that.
that story about what is a good life, I would put it this way. Liberalism has been for a while, not through its whole history, but for a while, about being like a neutral arbitrator between different groups. Now that liberalism itself is something that is under threat and in fights that it might lose, I don't think it can have that sort of hands-off approach. I think you need to
Mm,
make the case that, look, there are two types of life available for you here. One where you are of a particular place, blood and soil, and you have a little box that you go into. If you are a man, you behave like this. If you are white, you behave like
hmm
this. The other is to say, yes, you are of a particular place and so on. You're also of a country of many different people and many stories, and having a life in which you will hear those different stories is better for you. That is a more attractive life. I think
hmm
it's a difference, not in what we're trying to justify, but in how we try and justify it as liberals. Do we sort
Yeah.
of say it's about, as you say, oh, we're taking the rational view and that stuff doesn't matter? Or is it about, no, it does matter, but it's better to be in a pluralism of those things than in just one
hmm
thing? I think that's how I'd think that one through.
Yeah. I know, I mean, I absolutely think you're right. I just am wondering, and I know we're at time, I have to go, but I would love for another hour because I'm just wondering how I see it right now. I live in Georgia. I see just how attractive the former path is, not because it's better, but because it's more predictable. So this idea of like staying in the box and aligning yourself with a particular sense of behavior because of your gender and not ever kind of experiencing the kind of pluralism that I believe really is such an incredible quality of this country. Like I don't know that people are saying are exactly saying I wouldn't like that, but I think they're saying I don't know that. That's not knowable to me, and this other thing is very knowable to me, and that in itself drives this sort of I- drives this sort of this fear ends up this fear ends it's driven by fear, but it's shaped like a choice. It's shaped like an affirmative choice when it's actually a fearful choice. I don't know. I'm gonna have to think about this more. We're gonna have to do this again.
Yeah, let's
Because
do it again. I
the end
think,
of my
but
feeling,
I
my end of
think
my comments don't make any sense,
what you're
but
putting your finger on is that arguing for the fundamentals of liberalism, which I think for a while we thought we didn't have to do, and now we have to do again, is hard.
it's really hard.
And it's not emotionally easy as well. Because as much as I think the liberals are right, this is in many ways quite a demanding creed. We are saying you have to think
hmm
for yourself. And
hmm
that is actually scary in a lot of ways, right? And we're saying the world is a big, wide thing and you will find your own way in it. And that is scary.
I think
And
that's right. But are we also kind of saying we're saying you have to think for yourself, and we're also saying there is a wrong and right way to think. That
yes,
there are ways that you think that you could thinking for yourself does not make all thinking equal. And I
yes,
think that in itself um is complicated for people. I don't think it should be. I think these are pretty obvious conclusions, but I think they it's hard to hold both of those things in their head at the same time. And as a result, this idea that like I have the quote unquote wrong thought, I'm wrong thinking, is seen as thinking for yourself, even when it's not.
yep, I think that's 100% right. Let's do this again at some point because I feel like we
I would
could,
love to.
before I let you go, just quickly tell listeners where they should go if they want to read your work or follow you, Blue Sky website, Substack, anything like that.
Yeah. Substack is called the jumpline.substack.com. I'm at josieduffyrice.com. That's where you can find a lot of my work. And I'm on Blue Sky at J Duffy Rice. I'm not on Twitter anymore. I
Yep,
gave
I'm
up.
done with that now as well.
I had to. Yeah. That's a whole other we'd have a whole other conversation about that. But yeah, that's where you can find me. And thank you so much for having me on.
No, no, real pleasure. We'll have to do this again.